Deep in the wild, where beauty hides danger and every step can be life or death, things can turn deadly in an instant. From a grizzly bear attacking a stopped tour bus in Alaska to a lone camper facing a relentless brown bear in Romania's Carpathians, in this video you'll witness 6 stories that reveal the raw, unpredictable power of bears and the harrowing moments when humans come face to face with forces they never expected. On November 2nd, 2025, the interior of Alaska was already gripped by early snow, with low gray clouds pressing over the mountains and the scent of cold pine drifting through the valleys. A wildlife tour bus wound slowly along a narrow gravel road north of Talkeetna, carrying 8 passengers eager to catch their final glimpse of the Alaskan wilderness before winter sealed it in silence. The driver, Paul Mercer, a 45-year-old, had made the trip dozens of times before. Navigating through frost-rimmed spruce and alder thickets, his passengers bundled in parkas and gloves, their cameras aimed toward the white horizon. It was the last scheduled tour of the season, a quiet route where the animals were fewer but the land more haunting in its stillness. They had been driving for nearly 2 hours when Mercer noticed movement on the far side of a frozen marsh, a moose, its broad antlers dark against the snow-dusted reeds. Excited murmurs rippled through the bus, and he eased the vehicle to a stop on the shoulder, leaving the engine idling as the tourists pressed against the windows with their cameras. The air outside was still, and the faint sound of shutters clicking mixed with the wind whispering through dry grass. Mercer stood near the door, scanning the tree line beyond the marsh, his experience telling him that wildlife rarely stayed predictable this late in the year. Yet nothing seemed out of place until the quiet shifted, a sound almost too low to notice at first. The snap of branches, heavy and deliberate, coming from the dense alder brush only 30 feet away. From that shadowed thicket emerged a massive grizzly bear, its fur patchy and dull, the long hump of its shoulders glistening with frost. Its head swung low, nostrils flaring, its breath rising in pale clouds as it moved closer to the road. Mercer froze, recognizing at once that the bear's movements were not curious but tense, erratic, as if confusion or hunger were driving it. The tourists on board, unaware of the change in its posture, lifted their lenses eagerly toward the glass, believing they had been granted a rare sighting. But the bear's ears flattened, and with slow, uneven steps it began to circle the front of the bus, its claws scraping the gravel, its body weaving like a creature on edge. Mercer shut off the engine to minimize the vibration, hoping the bear would lose interest, but the sudden silence seemed to agitate it further. It paused by the front bumper, then rose on its hind legs, towering against the windshield, its size dwarfing everything around it. The passengers gasped as its massive paws landed with a hollow thud against the metal, and the sound echoed through the empty valley. For several seconds, it stared through the glass, eyes dark and unsteady, before dropping down and pacing toward the door. Mercer's instincts screamed to start the bus and drive, but the bear was already too close. Its claws hooked against the narrow steps as it struck the side mirror, breaking it loose. The bus rocked slightly, and one passenger stumbled against the seat, pressing their bleeding hand against the shards of broken glass that had showered down when the window cracked. The bear roared then, a deep, guttural sound that rattled the thin walls of the vehicle. Its head thrust forward, jaws snapping at the shattered door, and for an instant its foreleg came through the gap, swiping wildly. A woman near the front seat screamed as the claws caught her arm, slicing through her jacket and skin. Blood spotted the floor as Mercer slammed his hand against the horn, the blaring noise piercing the quiet air like a blade. The bear recoiled but didn't run. It dropped to all fours again and began pacing in circles, snorting and huffing clouds of steam, clearly distressed by the noise but still unwilling to leave. Mercer hit the horn again, holding it down longer, the echoes bouncing off the snowy ridges around them. Finally, the bear backed into the brush, its movement reluctant, its head turning several times before vanishing into the thicket from which it had come. Inside the bus, the passengers sat frozen, breathing hard, as the shock slowly settled in, the wind whistling through the cracks in the broken window. The woman who had been struck held her arm tightly, trembling, while another tourist had shallow cuts from flying glass. Mercer reached for the radio mounted by his seat and called for help, his voice low and steady, though his hands still shook. The nearest ranger station was over an hour away, but a helicopter was dispatched to meet them along the open stretch of road a few miles ahead. He started the bus, the engine groaning before catching, and eased it forward, his eyes flicking constantly toward the mirrors, half expecting the bear to reappear. By the time the helicopter reached them, snow had begun to fall again, coating the trees in a thin, glittering layer. The injured passengers were lifted out and flown toward Anchorage for treatment. Later, wildlife officials arrived to examine the tracks left near the road, deep impressions, uneven, circling patterns that suggested agitation more than aggression. They found tufts of coarse fur snagged on the broken mirror, indicating that the bear had been underweight for its size, possibly struggling to find enough food late in the season before hibernation. The early snow had sealed off the higher berry patches, and fish had grown scarce in the streams. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion often pushed bears closer to human activity in early November, and in this case, the noise of the bus might have startled it out of dense cover where it had been searching for roots or carrion. In the following days, news of the attack spread quickly through Alaska's small tourism network, reigniting debate about the safety of late-season wildlife tours. Some argued that such excursions placed unnecessary stress on animals already struggling to survive. In contrast, others claimed this was an isolated event, a tragic collision between curiosity and instinct at the edge of wilderness. Paul Mercer didn't return to work for several weeks, and when he finally did, he avoided that particular route, knowing the sight of alderbrush swaying in the cold wind would always bring back the echo of claws scraping steel. On March 12, 2024, the frozen coast of northern Alaska lay under a dim, colorless sky, where the horizon blurred into endless white and the air shimmered with cold so sharp it seemed alive. A small helicopter cut across that frozen silence, its blades sending fine snow whirling into the wind. Inside were three people: pilot David Harmon, 38, a seasoned veteran of remote flying; biologist Clara Jensen, 35, who had spent her career studying Arctic wildlife; and field technician Aaron Briggs, 29, who handled the recording gear and tagging equipment stacked neatly behind their seats. They were part of a government survey team, documenting seal populations across the drifting ice floes that stretched like fractured glass across the Beaufort Sea. After 2 hours of low flight, they spotted a cluster of seals sprawled along the edge of a wide floe, their gray bodies scattered over the pale ice like shadows. Harmon guided the helicopter down slowly, the skids settling with a soft creak on the crusted surface. The wind had calmed, leaving only the faint crack of distant shifting ice and the hum of the engine as it cooled. The team stepped out into air that burned their lungs with each breath, their boots sinking slightly into the snow as they unpacked their gear. Clara moved carefully, noting the SEAL group's behavior, while Aaron assembled the long-lens camera and recording instruments. Harmon stayed close to the helicopter, scanning the horizon as a pilot's habit, his eyes trained to notice movement even in the white monotony. The fog thickened soon after landing, rolling in from the north like a slow, living tide. Clara glanced back toward the helicopter several times, sensing the vast emptiness closing around them. To the untrained eye, the landscape appeared lifeless, but beneath the silence there was movement, faint, steady, deliberate. From the blur of fog beyond the ice ridge, a shape began to emerge, distant at first, its motion slow but unyielding. Harmon saw it before the others did, a pale outline moving against the equally pale background, so perfectly camouflaged that it seemed to materialize from the mist itself. At first he thought it might be another ridge of snow catching the wind, until it lifted its head and he saw the unmistakable shape of a polar bear. The bear was enormous, its fur yellowed by age and hunger, its shoulders heavy, but its body thinner than it should have been for early spring. It moved with an uneven gait, head swinging low, sniffing the air as it approached. Polar bears, Clara knew, were driven by smell more than sight, and the helicopter's fuel scent, the sweat of humans, and the faint trace of seal flesh in the air were enough to draw it across the frozen expanse. Harmon signaled for everyone to get back inside, his voice steady but urgent, the wind rising again as if warning them of what was coming. The bear picked up speed, closing the distance quickly across the open ice, its long claws scraping the surface with each stride. Clara climbed into the back seat, pulling the door halfway shut as Harmon started the engine, his fingers trembling against the ignition. The rotors began to spin, scattering loose snow, but before the lift could build, the bear was already there, slamming into the side of the helicopter with a force that shook the entire frame. The metal groaned, and one of the skids shifted, scraping deep into the ice. The bear's paws came down hard again, claws carving into aluminum, its breath blasting through the open door where Harmon's leg had not yet pulled back. One swipe connected, tearing through his flight suit and deep into his thigh, a flash of red against white. He shouted in pain, instinctively hitting the throttle, trying to lift off even as the machine rocked dangerously. Clara grabbed the canister of bear deterrent from under the seat, yanking the safety tab free and spraying through the open gap. The orange mist burst into the air, carried by the rotor wash directly toward the bear's face. The animal reared back, roaring in fury, striking again at the skids and tearing loose a small panel that clattered across the ice. Snow and fuel residue mixed in the air, stinging their eyes, and the helicopter pitched slightly as Harmon fought for control. Aaron reached for the emergency flares, lighting one and throwing it out toward the bear's feet. The flare hissed, red and violent against the white, rolling and sputtering near the creature's chest. For several seconds the bear hesitated, swinging its head back and forth, its black eyes wide and uncertain, its breath visible in heavy clouds. Then it lunged again, ramming its shoulder into the front of the helicopter, nearly toppling it. The sound was deafening. Rotors cutting through air, the engine straining, the flare crackling, all merging into one chaotic roar. Harmon gritted his teeth through the pain, forcing the throttle higher, the helicopter straining to rise as the bear continued to strike. Finally, as the combined noise and light reached a fever pitch, the bear stumbled back, disoriented and blinded by the deterrent. It turned away, lumbering slowly toward the fog, stopping once to look back before vanishing into the white haze that had swallowed the horizon. Harmon managed to keep the machine hovering low enough to stay stable until Clara reached forward and secured his bleeding leg with a strap torn from a backpack. The floor was smeared with snow and blood, and Aaron was still clutching the flare pistol, his hands shaking. The helicopter rose unsteadily, its side dented and the left panel flapping loose, but the engine held. They flew southeast toward the nearest coastal outpost, the flight taking 20 agonizing minutes through blinding fog and turbulence. Harmon's face was pale, jaw clenched against the pain, while Clara pressed his leg to slow the bleeding, her other hand gripping the seat frame to steady herself. When they finally landed, medical crews rushed to pull them out, their boots crunching over the icy pad as the rotors slowed. Harmon's leg was broken and deeply lacerated, the wound just missing a major artery. Clara's arm was bruised and scratched, and Aaron's shoulder ached from where he had been thrown against the doorframe. Later, wildlife experts confirmed that the bear was likely in severe starvation after a season of poor ice coverage, its desperate behavior a reflection of how rapidly the Arctic's balance was collapsing. They warned that such encounters would become more common as the sea ice thinned earlier each year, forcing predators and people ever closer together in the fading cold. On October 15, 2023, the narrow coves of Kodiak Island were wrapped in thick morning fog, the air heavy with salt and the faint scent of rotting salmon carried by the tide. The sea lapped softly against the pebbled shore, and from the distant hills came the low moan of wind through spruce. Thomas Keller, 44 years old, stood by his weathered skiff, its paint dulled by years of salt spray, preparing his nets for another long day of work. For 15 seasons, he had returned to this same remote stretch of coastline, a hidden cove known to few but spoken of fondly by those who fished there. To him, it was more than a fishing spot. It was a ritual, a place where he felt part of something older and quieter than himself. Keller was known among the locals in Larsen Bay as a man who respected the bears that ruled the island. He never carried a rifle unless traveling deep inland, and even then it stayed slung over his shoulder, rarely touched. He believed in keeping distance, in sharing the space rather than fighting for it. He spoke of the great brown bears as if they were neighbors with predictable moods, creatures to be acknowledged, not feared. Over the years, a few bears had become familiar to him, massive shapes that passed through the alder groves or along the tidal flats, leaving deep prints in the sand. He watched them often, always from afar, understanding that on Kodiak, coexistence was built on respect and rhythm. That autumn had been colder than usual, and the salmon run came later, forcing the bears to linger near the streams longer than expected. Keller spent most of his days alone, drying fish near camp and setting nets just beyond the mouth of the cove. His camp was marked by a small tarp shelter and the faint smell of wood smoke drifting through the mist. He made careful efforts to leave fish remains far from camp, dragging them down shore where the tide could take them, ensuring no bear would be tempted to get too close. Yet as the fog thickened and daylight shortened, the island's silence seemed to change, as if something vast and unseen moved just beyond the trees. That morning, visibility barely stretched beyond 30 yards. Keller's breath formed pale clouds as he checked the lines strung between driftwood poles, where salmon fillets hung to dry. He wore his old canvas jacket, its cuffs frayed from years of use, and boots caked in sand. Somewhere out on the flats, gulls cried sharply, their wings flashing like white sparks through the gray air. The tide had dropped lower than usual, leaving a stretch of glistening mud that gleamed faintly in the weak light. It was in that half-silence that he heard it, a low rustle, followed by the slow crunch of weight shifting through the reeds near the waterline. He turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing, and caught a shadowed shape moving through the fog. A bear, massive and dark, its fur heavy with moisture, its breath visible in rhythmic bursts. It was close, closer than he realized, and for a brief moment neither moved. He had seen bears many times before, but this one felt different, heavier, slower, as though hunger rather than curiosity drove it. The bear advanced a few steps, head swinging low, testing the air, its attention drawn toward the fish rack behind him. Keller knew better than to shout or run, yet instinct told him to make his presence clear. Somewhere in those seconds, he likely reached for the small handheld radio or satellite phone kept by his tent. Later, rescuers would find a voice note recorded on it, a faint and crackling message in which his calm voice mentioned one big brown moving through the reeds. After that, silence. When Keller failed to check in that evening, the harbor operator grew uneasy. The next morning, a search crew flew out along the coast, following his usual fishing route. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a stretch of shoreline marked by strange disturbances, shredded netting tangled among rocks, an overturned skiff half buried in wet sand, and boot prints scattered in looping patterns that ended in a churned patch near the tide line. Around it lay drag marks, deep and erratic, fading toward the edge of the marsh where reeds bent in broken swaths. The investigators moved carefully, aware that a bear could still be near, the air thick with the metallic scent of salt and something else they chose not to name aloud. They recovered the satellite phone lodged under a pile of wet kelp, its casing cracked but still functional enough to reveal the short voice note. It lasted only 6 seconds, ending abruptly as though interrupted mid-thought. No rifle was found nearby, only Keller's fishing vest and the remains of his gear strewn across the sand. A few hundred yards inland, they discovered a feeding site, freshly turned earth and fish remnants, the kind of place where a bear might return repeatedly. Investigators later concluded that Keller must have approached too close, perhaps to retrieve a torn section of net or check on a snagged fish, and startled the animal as it guarded its food. The tracks suggested a sudden burst of movement, an attack that lasted only moments. The bear was not hunted afterward. Wildlife officers decided the encounter was defensive, not predatory, and the island's fragile balance depended on avoiding unnecessary killings. Locals mourned Keller quietly, holding a small gathering at the dock where his skiff had once been tied. They spoke of him not as a reckless man, but as someone who trusted too deeply in the patterns of the wild, believing that respect alone would keep danger at bay. His friend said he moved through the wilderness with the patience of a man who listened before he acted, who knew the weight of solitude and found comfort in its company. In the years that followed, his camp remained untouched, slowly reclaiming the land with moss and wind. On August 21st, 2021, the forests of northern Maine lay heavy with late summer mist, the air damp and cool above a winding river that moved quietly between thick walls of spruce and cedar. Wildlife photographer Sophie Lang, 33 years old, guided her small green canoe through the still water, her camera resting between her knees, its lens fogged slightly by the morning chill. She had come alone, as she often did, drawn to the solitude and the soft light that fell over the valley in late August, when salmon began their upriver migration. The silence was broken only by the rhythm of her paddle, dipping and rising, with droplets breaking the surface in slow, deliberate motion. Sophie had been working for 2 days, camping along the bends and photographing the salmon as they moved through the shallows, their bodies flickering silver beneath the surface. That morning, she reached a stretch of river that widened briefly before narrowing again, the kind of place where the current split around smooth stones and created shallow riffles perfect for photographs. She eased the canoe toward the bank, the bow scraping lightly against gravel, and stepped out carefully, camera in hand, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The light had turned soft and golden through the mist, and she crouched low, focusing on the shimmering movement beneath the water. The forest behind her was still, dense with ferns and low berry brush that grew thick near the edge of the river. She noticed the faint sound of something shifting, branches cracking, foliage rustling in slow, uneven rhythm, but thought little of it, assuming it was wind or perhaps a deer moving through the trees. Her camera shutter clicked several times, echoing faintly off the water, before the sound from behind grew sharper, heavier, closer. When she turned, she saw it. A black bear, large and dark, emerging from the brush less than 10 meters away, its fur matted from moisture, its head swinging low as it tested the air. For one suspended second, neither moved. The mist wavered between them, blurring the distance, and the bear seemed as startled as she was. Then it lowered its head and charged. The rush of movement came faster than she could think, the sound of claws tearing through mud, of water splashing as it crossed the narrow riverbank. Sophie stumbled backward toward the canoe, heart hammering, camera still hanging from her neck as she reached for the gunwale. The bear's weight struck the front of the canoe, its paw smashing against the bow with a heavy crack that split the wood and sent water splashing over her legs. The canoe tilted dangerously, and her camera dropped into the shallow water beside her, sinking beneath silt and foam. She reached for the paddle instinctively, gripping it like a barrier, swinging it in wide arcs as the bear lunged again. The paddle struck its shoulder with a hollow thud, slowing it only for a moment before another swipe sent splinters flying. Sophie fell backward, half inside the canoe, the edge of the hull biting into her thigh as she tried to keep her balance. The bear roared, its breath visible in the damp air, the sound deep and vibrating through her chest. She fumbled for the canister of bear spray clipped to her pack, tearing it free with trembling hands. As the bear lunged once more, she raised the spray and pressed the trigger. The orange mist erupted directly into its face, swirling through the fog, coating its muzzle and eyes. The bear reared up, shaking its head violently, pawing at the air as it coughed and snorted. Sophie sprayed again, sweeping the cloud wider, backing away through the shallows, her boots slipping on smooth stones as water rose around her ankles. The bear stumbled to the side, blinded and disoriented, its growls turning to frustrated grunts as it retreated several steps into the brush. For a moment it lingered, pacing in confusion, then finally turned and crashed through the trees, vanishing into the mist that hung over the forest floor. Sophie stood motionless for nearly a minute, listening to the sounds fade until all that remained was the drip of water from the canoe's cracked hull and the faint hum of insects returning. Her arms and shoulders burned where the claws had grazed her, leaving deep cuts through her jacket. Blood ran in thin lines down her sleeves, and her hands shook uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to ebb. She forced herself to breathe steadily, checking her limbs to confirm she could still move. The canoe listed slightly but remained afloat, and she climbed inside, pushing off the bank with the broken paddle until the current carried her downstream. The journey back to her camp took hours, each bend of the river stretching endlessly as her strength waned. The fog thickened again in patches, swallowing the forest edges, and every crack of a branch from the shoreline sent a jolt of fear through her chest. When she finally reached the gravel bar where she had pitched her tent, she pulled the canoe onto the shore and collapsed beside it, too weak to move for several minutes. She cleaned her wounds with river water and the small first aid kit she always carried, wrapping her arms tightly before building a fire to signal for help. Wildlife officers reached her the following morning after receiving a satellite alert from her emergency beacon. They found the canoe damaged, its bow torn open and streaked with mud. Her camera was lost to the river, and claw marks were embedded deep into the wood. After treating her injuries, they examined the area where the attack had occurred and found tracks and broken reeds leading into the dense brush. They concluded that the bear had likely been feeding nearby, drawn to the salmon-rich shallows, and that Sophie had startled it at close range in low visibility. Experts later noted that while black bears rarely act aggressively, even experienced outdoors people can misjudge the risks when silence, fog, and instinct collide. For Sophie Lang, The experience became a harsh reminder of how thin the line can be between beauty and danger in wild places, where the pursuit of a perfect image can so easily cross into survival. On October 22, 2019, the morning mist hung low over the cracked tarmac of a small regional airfield deep in Ussuri Krai, eastern Russia. The facility, isolated among endless pine and birch, served only a handful of supply flights each week. Its workers were accustomed to the silence, to the distant crows and the whisper of the wind through the surrounding forest. That morning, ground technician Yuri Antonov, 47, had been inspecting one of the aging hangar doors when he noticed movement at the tree line beyond the fence. The light was gray and uneven, the kind that makes shadows seem to breathe. At first, he thought it was a stray dog scavenging through the rubbish pile near the maintenance sheds, but as the shape rose and shifted, he saw the unmistakable bulk of a brown bear, broad shoulders, thick fur matted with mud, and eyes that caught the light with a dull reflection. It was a Russian grizzly, and it had found its way through a section of fence damaged weeks earlier by a fallen tree. The airfield's small team had complained about the gap, but repairs had been delayed until the next supply delivery. Now the oversight had opened a path from wilderness to machinery. The bear's ribs showed through its fur, and it moved with the slow, restless gait of an animal half-starved. The season had been harsh, salmon runs were poor, berries scarce. As autumn turned colder, many bears in the region grew desperate, wandering closer to settlements and work camps in search of anything edible. The airfield's refuse bins overflowed with discarded packaging, oil-soaked rags, and food scraps from workers' meals. The scent had drifted into the forest, and hunger had done the rest. Antonov radioed two co-workers, Pavel and Mikhail, who were checking equipment inside the hangar. They emerged cautiously, each grabbing what they could find. One carried a hand flare, the other a metal bar. The men tried to scare the bear back toward the trees, shouting and banging on the truck's side panels. At first it hesitated, shifting its weight as though considering retreat. Then something in its demeanor changed. With a guttural sound, it lowered its head and began moving toward them in a heavy, deliberate stride that quickened with each step. Antonov leaped into the driver's seat of the old utility truck, turning the engine over until it sputtered to life. He revved it hard, pushing forward to block the bear's path. For a second, it seemed to work. The animal stopped, rearing slightly, nostrils flaring. Then it struck, slamming into the truck's front quarter panel with enough force to dent the metal and rock the vehicle sideways. The noise of claws scraping steel echoed through the airfield. Pavel fired a flare, the bright red light hissing across the tarmac, but the bear ignored it, circling toward the open door of the truck. Antonov tried to reverse, but the tires spun on the damp surface. The bear lunged again, swiping through the open window, striking his shoulder and neck. The force threw him sideways, and blood streaked the glass. Mikhail ran forward, shouting and waving his arms, but the bear turned on him with terrifying speed. It knocked him to the ground, snapping at his leg before the roar of nearby turbine engines filled the air. Two pilots, preparing for an outbound flight, had seen the chaos and started the aircraft's engines. The blast of heat and the deafening roar drove through the mist, startling the bear. It backed away, shaking its head, then turned and lumbered toward the broken fence, vanishing into the forest as quickly as it had come. Silence returned, broken only by the thrum of the engines winding down and the distant caw of ravens circling overhead. Antonov was barely conscious when the others reached him. His injuries were severe, deep lacerations across his chest and throat, blood soaking his uniform. The small airfield had no medical staff, only a radio link to a hospital over an hour's flight away. Despite his co-workers' efforts, he died before help could arrive. Mikhail survived, his leg torn but treatable, and was later evacuated by helicopter. In the following days, regional wildlife officers tracked the bear's trail through the forest, finding signs of scavenging and a half-collapsed den near a stream. They eventually tranquilized it several kilometers away, thin and exhausted, its paws stained with oil and mud. The animal was relocated to a remote reserve north of Primorsky Krai, though biologists doubted it would survive the coming winter. They cited worsening food shortages, shrinking habitat, and growing contact between humans and large predators as the region's forests were steadily cleared for logging. Investigators concluded that the attack could have been prevented. The damaged fence, the unsecured waste, and the lack of proper deterrence measures had all played a part. The Aviation Authority imposed stricter rules on all rural airstrips, including mandatory fencing repairs, controlled waste disposal, and emergency training for personnel stationed in areas with bear populations. For those who worked at the Ussuri Krai airfield, the incident left an emptiness that hung over every shift. Antonov had been a quiet, reliable man who preferred fixing engines to talking. He had once joked that the forest was his only neighbor, that its silence helped him think more clearly. After his death, workers noticed how the silence felt heavier. They spoke less, stayed closer to the sheds, and kept the floodlights burning long into the night. The story of the attack spread through nearby towns, a grim reminder of how thin the boundary had become between human work and wild survival. In a place where the taiga still stretches farther than roads, the cost of forgetting that truth could be fatal. The airfield continued operating, but every new sound in the dark, the crack of a branch, the shuffle of something unseen beyond the fence, carried a quiet weight of fear, a warning written in the cold breath of the Russian wilderness. On July 19, 2025, the night had been unusually still in the Carpathian Mountains, the kind of silence that seems to swallow even the wind. Marek Novak, a 34-year-old camper from the Czech Republic, had chosen a remote clearing several kilometers from any marked trail. He'd hiked most of the day beneath the dark fir canopy, following the echo of a stream and the calls of distant owls until he found a patch of level ground beneath a ridge. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, and when the sun fell, he sat by his small stove, eating soup from a tin while fog rose from the forest floor. He had camped alone before, confident in his knowledge and gear, but that confidence would soon dissolve into fear he'd never known. Sometime after midnight, he awoke to the sound of branches cracking in the distance. At first, he thought it was the wind or perhaps a deer passing near the stream, but then came a sound lower and heavier, a grunt deep and guttural vibrating through the ground. His pulse quickened as he unzipped his sleeping bag and reached for his headlamp. The beam of light illuminated the inner walls of the tent, trembling as his hand shook. Outside, something large was moving in slow, deliberate circles around the campsite. The scent hit him next, a sharp musk mixed with the odor of earth and rot. He knew it instantly, a brown bear. He froze, listening to its breathing grow louder, its steps pressing into the soft earth. The animal brushed against his tent, the nylon rippling with each movement. Then, without warning, a massive paw pressed down against the side, flattening the fabric inches from his face. Marek stifled a gasp. The bear sniffed, huffed, and clawed lightly, testing the strange structure before pulling back. For several moments, there was only silence, and he thought it might leave. Then came the sound of tearing fabric. The tent shuddered as the bear raked its claws across it. Marek scrambled backward, grabbing his bear spray and flashlight. He shouted, his voice cracking in the darkness. But the animal responded with a deep snarl and charged, striking the side of the tent with such force that it collapsed halfway. He could hear its breath, loud and wet, as it pawed at his pack near the entrance. The smell of food, small crumbs, maybe a bit of soup spilled earlier, had betrayed him. He cursed himself for not hanging it away from camp. He tried to shine the headlamp directly toward the noise, but the bear lunged again, slamming into the tent. The beam flickered as the lamp flew from his hand. Marek dove beneath his sleeping bag, curling tight as the animal's claws tore through the upper layers of fabric. Pain shot through his forearm as one claw caught him, opening a long, burning gash. He could hear the fabric ripping and the poles snapping, the tent no longer a barrier but a shredded shell. Minutes blurred into an eternity of noise, snorts, growls, the rustling of the bear circling, pressing, retreating, then returning. Each time Marek moved or breathed too loudly, the creature reacted, stomping or clawing again. He could feel the cold night air pouring through the holes and the smell of fear thick in his throat. He reached for the bear spray again, gripping it with blood-slick fingers. When the bear's snout pressed against the opening near his boots, he squeezed the trigger. The hiss of the spray filled the air, followed by a loud, furious roar. The bear stumbled back, coughing and shaking its head. Marek could hear it thrashing in the brush beyond the tent. For a few seconds, silence returned. He barely breathed, hoping the attack was over. But the bear came back. It circled again, pacing heavily, grumbling, and occasionally slapping the tent as if testing whether the strange creature inside was still alive. Each pass felt like an hour. Marek remained curled up, whispering to himself to stay calm. The bear's persistence seemed endless. It was not the quick charge of defense, but the hungry, deliberate curiosity of a predator that had learned humans sometimes carried food. Hours passed. The forest began to pale with the first hint of dawn, a faint gray light filtering through the torn tent walls. Merrick's arms and shoulders throbbed, his skin sticky with blood and dirt. He no longer dared to move. The bear's movements slowed as the sky brightened, its growls softer, less certain. Finally, with a long grunt and a crashing of undergrowth, it turned and lumbered back toward the trees. The forest swallowed the sound of its departure. Merrick stayed still for nearly half an hour, afraid it might return. When he finally crawled out, the morning was cold and damp, the ground around his camp shredded and scattered. His tent looked like it had exploded. Deep paw prints pressed into the mud, some only a meter from where he'd lain. His backpack was torn open, its contents scattered across the grass, including food and clothes. He packed what little he could salvage and followed the river downstream, every noise in the forest making him flinch. He reached a ranger station by afternoon, dehydrated and shivering, his forearm bandaged with strips from his shirt. Rangers helped treat his wounds and later returned to the site to collect his gear. They found clear signs of a large brown bear, fresh scat, claw marks on a nearby tree, and tufts of fur caught in the tent fabric. Experts explained that the bear had likely been drawn by the scent of food and had spent hours testing the tent, uncertain but unwilling to leave a potential meal behind. Merrick later said the longest night of his life had taught him a lesson that every camper in bear country should know. Curiosity and hunger can make even cautious animals relentless. He survived, but his encounter served as a grim example of how close the line can be between solitude and survival, when humans forget that the forest is never truly theirs.